last part of the 19th century, though not quite contemporary, but knowing about how New York is laid out, about the Croton Reservoir, about 5 Points, and about all the different characters, Devery and the police commissioner Barnes, and all the different people, and meeting them in a real-life historical context was very interesting. Having it, and the reverse is true. You read something about a subject that you're interested in, and then you go read fiction and say, oh, this is what he's doing. This is how he's depicting the guy. This is how he's treating them. And you learn a lot about what the author's state of mind is when writing, when you see something you recognize rather than being introduced to it for the first time. So people talk about, well, why you read history stuff, how boring. Not when it's well written.
No.
So, I didn't have to sell that to this audience.
Hi, I'm Vinny.
Hi, Vinny.
I cultivate my 2 late sicknesses at Readercon, bookaholism and imposter syndrome. What's that?
Okay.
What you were just saying drove home to me how guilty I feel when I get caught out when my knowledge of history in particular turns out to come from historical novels.
It's Georgette Hire syndrome.
Yeah.
But you can fix that. There are always more books to read.
That's true.
Other historical novels.
What's that?
Other historical novels.
Yes.
That's right.
You figure if like 2 or 3 contain the same thing, either they
probably
each other,
from the same
or
yeah.
either there's more of that intertextuality going on, or it's true.
Okay, maybe my turn now for a new book that I've read.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Please.
okay. I'm always taking a book and reading it and drawing a general conclusion. It can be very boring, but I'll do it anyway. One book I've been reading is The Collected Stories of Neil Barrett Jr. One, he's a really fine writer. 2, he has not been given the amount of attention that he warrants over the years. He published with the wrong publishers, he published at the wrong time, he changed genres too often. But at the same time, we now have, from I think it's Subterranean. Subterranean Press is publishing his collected stories. 1, they're great stories. 2, they're being published well by a house that publishes for this audience here. And this audience here is the kind of audience, kind of readership, kind of companionship that will actually buy a book by Neil Barrett Jr., who, if he'd been writing outside the genre, would have been dead now of starvation. But he's not. He's 82 or 3, and he's still a live person. So a book like that is something which we're kind of like privileged to be able to read. It's not just something that comes at random. It comes because we're a shaped group of people who support what is valuable in what we've done. Next book that I read after that was a book called The Time Ship by a Spanish author of the 19th century called Gaspar, G-A-S-P-A-R. I forget his first name. I think it's Enrico or Enrique. Sorry? Enrique. It is Enrique. It's published by Wesleyan University Press. It's a translation of a book which had never been translated before. Within the science fiction context, last year at the British Library exhibition, Out of This World, and you don't know what the heck you're finding here, but come in and take a look, sort of thing, long subtitle, which is very successful. British Library had never done science fiction before, and 120,000 people went through this exhibition. The thing that nobody else had ever seen or ever heard of was the original Spanish cover, bright illustrated cover of a book called Novellas, Spanish for story. And the middle of it was a time machine. It looked like a kind of balloon, something like Verne's Nautilus in the air. It was really kind of romantic and beautifully drawn. And then you realize when you look at the label that this bloody thing was published 7 or 8 years before Wells published The Time Machine. Shocking. Interesting. The thing is, it's shocking to us not to have known, but there was no reason really we should have known. The book The Time Machine itself was given a weird Spanish title. If you can remember it, Greg. Chronopede, something like
Yeah.
Acronopede, something like that. The kind of title that you're not going to remember. Certainly, if it is listed as a story in a book of other stories, even though it made up most of that book, and is never republished in Spanish. So, it's not our fault. It's our opportunity to be in a world where Wesleyan University Press, they find out about this, and really fast, because I think they were inspired by the discovery, they commissioned a translation, and we have a translation of this astonishingly eccentric but very specific description of a mechanical time machine that's got a large crew and goes back in time, and if it's going very slowly back in time and they're looking out through the portholes, you see time and reverse effects because they're going back, the people are going forward, so they're watching events. And you get a battle from 1860, you get, you go to the court of, I think, Isabella, 1492, and then you go back to China in 200 AD, and they find that the Chinese are completely unimpressed by European technology because they've all done it half a dozen times and forgotten it half a dozen times. And then it goes back.
All elves are gay.
Then it goes back to the time of Noah, and this space ark becomes a real ark, although not Noah's ark, but it becomes an ark. And then they go back to the beginning of the world, primordial chaos, and everything blows up in their faces and they all die and they wake up and it's a dream. But that's the usual way that imaginary thought experiments tended to work in the 19th century. Very frequently, there was some way of putting a frame around it so you didn't have to be, there was no culture of us to say it's all right to pretend to believe it's real. So it had to be put in a kind of frame. But it's completely remarkable. It wouldn't have happened anywhere else because we get this. We buy the book. Not very many of us probably, but we should. It's in paperback, not that expensive. It's interesting. It's completely scatty. It's rather funny. It was based on what's called a zarzuela, a Spanish operetta with spoken dialogue in the French fashion, which was never produced. He did a bunch of zarzuelas, this guy. He was also a diplomat. It was based on those zarzuelas. So you have all these farcical things happening which make it possible to tell a kind of story that we don't need farce to pretend to believe. But he did in 1887. So all of this stuff we learned just by looking at this one book that we're privileged to be able to read because we will buy that kind of book. And that, I think, is a real description of how you focus Bookaholics. Buying the book, keeping the book, remembering the book, going to an exhibition and seeing a book cover and saying, I want to buy that book. That describes to me bookaholism as a real positive thing, not just a personal habit.
I have a question for you, John, actually, while we're talking about non-Western, well, non-English language genre fiction. I was just at a panel an hour ago with Menendez Singh, who was talking about Bengali science fiction from the 19th century. And
I'm editing an entry on it for the encyclopedia right now.
of course.
Yeah,
But
I don't know a thing about it yet. I'm just going to edit it.
But how exciting is that? I mean,
Very.
we talked about multicultural genre fiction. I mean, the archetype for me is Stanislaw Lem. That everybody's rushed up against or knows about Lem, about Solaris, and about Tyler Perks and all these things. And they were originally not published in English either. But how about things like China and India and I don't know, Malaysia? Are we getting more and more of that? And are we?
I think we are.
And
we're a monolingual culture, and we don't really like to read other languages, and we're not comfortable doing so. But inevitably, I'm certainly not behind this thing to talk about encyclopedia of science fiction. But the difference between the current edition and the previous ones is that the current edition is going to have an entry on Bengali SF.
And that's wonderful. I mean,
because we just can no longer pretend that science fiction is a Western phenomenon.
well, not even just not Western, but I mean, even in the West, it's been in German. There's a lot of good German science fiction. Oh, and by the way, there's a lot of bad German science fiction. No, I mean, most people, if you say German science fiction, people have two-word responses. The word response is Harry Rodin.
Yeah.
Now, my comment on that.
3 or 400 of them were pretty good.
Yeah, well, Forrest Ackerman translated a bunch of them for paperback back in the 60s and 70s. And I read a bunch of them, and I said, and my comment was, I really like number 91. Yeah, I read the first 90. I gave up after that, but there was one really good story, but a lot of it was direct. But that's the only thing people see of German science fiction. There's a lot of good German science fiction, none of which I can bring to mind.
There is a lot, but this isn't the panel.
Yes, sir. Bob, we know you
Oh,
are.
yeah, could I bring up one other thing, the science fiction, the Hugo nominee for fan, among others, Joe Alden.
No, she's here, because I'm doing a panel with her.
Yeah. The book that's been nominated for Hugo this year can be read as either not really science fiction or fantasy or anyway, it's a mixed genre thing, but it's about the maturing of a young girl with a science fiction fan. It includes all the books she grew up on, which is what you'd expect in the 60s and early 70s science fiction.
Among others.
What I think of the books I grew up with, if you haven't, all the Bradburys out now. You haven't read all the Bradbury, you should go do that. I don't think I probably have to say that to this room full of people. Let's find somebody who's new to Readercon who has a book to recommend. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Steve. I'm a bookaholic.
Hi, Steve.
I've gotten my Amazon open order list down to 12 right now. So, but one of the things I've found a lot recently, very large books that are just too big to actually carry around. So I tend to leave them in place, and it takes even longer to finish them. One of the ones I just finished was Cordwainer Smith's Rediscovery of Man, the complete short story collection. It's just amazing reading the entire body of work that fits together as a body.
And you might add, because I keep on waiting about the same thing, that he did a lot of other things in his life that wasn't really until he was able to unleash his spare time imagination within the context of reading traditional space opera, which he transformed. There was a form that existed and that he was able to take advantage of. It wasn't until then that this whole explosion happened, and he wrote almost everything he wrote in, 5 to 8 year period.
I have another question before we take the next suggestion, and Devin, can you be able to do this? What do people think about e-books, and to what extent?
No.
I would mention it. To what extent has that affected, if it has affected it at all, to what extent has that affected your reading habit or compulsion? Does it make yes, sir.
I have a phone in my pocket, which means that I never don't have, there's no time when I do not have dozens of books with me.
Okay.
It is not my favorite reading if I have physical books on hand, but the fact that there is never a time when I don't have the option of sitting down and reading a book is a wonderful thing.
I think I would tend to agree. I prefer physical to non-physical, but I like the idea that there are things that I can't get physically that I can look at. And it's very true for research for me, so I'll say that.
It's e-books having a role as about me, implying that e-books will replace everything else. They are supplementary, complementary, and different things.
As you know, escalators have replaced stairs everywhere. and segways have replaced walking, and
Exactly.
television has replaced radio.
So the need for books still exists, and that makes me happy.
And I'm not arguing that we should replace it, but to some extent it augments our ability to read things. Yes, ma'am.
I guess my name's Eileen.
Eileen.
And I had a related question, which is, I move every 18 months. Not by choice, just by chance, and moving books is a thing, and so I can read a lot more now that I have an e-reader. But does anybody have suggestions on how to pack and or ship and or move your books cheaply and or conveniently?
Do you have to
Large numbers.
Yeah.
Always do as much as possible. Don't try to economize on what you do. try to remove, because the cost per book, as you increase the volume, radically reduces. Don't do anything, don't do any move.
Is there a
piecemeal.
service for this? It would be great.
Just do too much rather than too little, and it'll cost you less.
Yeah, we've only moved twice, and I think the reason we've only moved twice is because my wife and I were colliding bookaholics, and we have books in many languages.
This is my 14th apartment.
You don't have me. I've moved on average every 2.5 years
Yes.
for the last 54.
So what do you do?
I've finally gotten it down to a system. We're talking 4,000 books approximately. Buy good cubic 12-inch by 12-inch by 12-inch boxes. They'll fit hardbacks well.
That's 2 cubic foot.
I'm sorry?
That makes 2 cubic feet?
No, it makes 1 cubic foot. 2 by 2, 1 by 1 by 1. I'm sorry, 12 by 12 by 12.
That's smaller than
But boxes of uniform size that stack.
Yes, and the 12-inch, the 1 cube fits paperbacks well and fits hardbacks well. Not, you have to set aside all the odd sized ones, but, and then I just write copiously on the outside of every single box so that I can still find what I need to find.
But it's very important, is it, to always have the same size of boxes that are modules.
Yes, yes.
Don't get boxes from the grocery store.
No.
From painful
That's different
experience,
sizes.
if you're much bigger than that,
Yes, you
you
can't
will scare
carry
yourself.
No, thank you, because that's the other point. It makes a very nice limitation on the weight of any one individual box.
Yeah,
You know, 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot box.
No, 12 by 12 by 12. 12 by 12.
I used 1 by 2 by 1, I think. I was about like that. That was suiting me, but the thing was that they were, when I had to move things, they were invariants by size. And that is probably more important than the actual size. They have to be invariant, and you have to be able to stack them, you have to be able to store them, because you don't know what's going to happen.
Oh, and you can't get away with folding over the flats in order to close like the bottom. You gotta use tape.
No,
You
you have to
have to
seal
use
it.
tape.
Yes.
I'd like to make one other observation.
Depending on how many books you have, we have discovered that moving companies that are also affiliated with storage companies are more willing to take back roads to avoid, when they're overweight, to avoid the main highways and the way stations. So if you find, seriously, a moving company that also affiliates with a storage company.
Okay, thank you.
I should like to make one other observation, and this is pertinent to moving, I suspect. My feeling about ebooks versus real books is the books that I want to own are books that I want to own physically. The books I simply want to consume, whether I remember what I've read or not, books I want to read and then move on from are either books I will get from the library or I'm content to have in ebook form, because that permits me to carry them around and not worry about the fact that I may have to move them. But I have a fairly well-used paperback of Dandelion Wine that Bradbury signed for me in 2006 personally, and that is never going to replace me. But I think to some extent when you decide to move, you have to decide, is this worth moving? And ebooks to some extent may give you the opportunity to take those things with you without having any particular attachment to a physical copy. And I think that's okay. I don't think that means that you've divorced yourself from the world of real books. And that's my take on it. I don't know how you feel about it.
I think you could almost argue, that bookaholics, when they're young, who buy anything and store anything, and book collectors who read what they have and try to make sense of it, like I want to try to do. Maybe the real crisis point, the point that you learn that you're going to grow up, is when you have to move.
Yeah.
And when you move and you do it properly, you get rid of thousands of books. Okay, I'm going to do one more thing very quickly.
Please.
Okay.
I think everybody's here to listen to you, which is good.
It's lucky because I'm here to talk all of that. Yeah, one thing, I bought a book a few days ago. This is book collector stuff. It's also bookaholic stuff in the way we would describe it. Now, I found this book up in Maine. I didn't buy it immediately because I didn't know what it was, because I thought it might be just some kind of nonsense. Okay, it's called, here it is, Pinocchio's Adventures in Wonderland. Okay? Now, I thought, I'm going to wait for this. I don't want some kind kind of idiot late 19th century spin-off trying to pretend that Pinocchio is palling up with Alice in Wonderland. Partly his book was actually very expensive, I couldn't just buy it. So I go back home and I research the book and I find out, this is a book that was published in 1898. It's I think the second translation of Pinocchio into English, the first actually published properly in the States. And what they did in the book culture then, which was not exactly the same as the book culture here, although the spin-offs are fairly common, was this little firm decided what they do is they try to increase their market share by putting Singing Wonderland in the book. So once I learned that, then I learned that there was an irreplaceable bit of knowledge of, you read the translation, I've read most of it now, it's a very short book. You read it in this context, you read it because you know that this book is published by a small Boston firm designed for children of upwardly mobile middle-class people, because there's a little introduction that says, this book is said to be based on German fairy tales. All of this comes out not of reading it electronically, which you probably wouldn't be able to do anyway, but it comes out of the actual examination and poring over and as it were, book collector minutiae gaze on a single item. And that single item is like it's like a flower. 1,000 flowers bloom from almost any book. But a book like this, which is rather weird and small, unimportant in itself, it exfoliates into our kind of knowledge.
Is it carry that forward to those you meet, the young people who are reading. We have probably time for. Let's take one more question, and then I think we're going to go to somebody who has not spoken. I've spoken.
Hi, I'm Judy.
Hi, Judy.
I actually know Walter fairly well, and so I'm going to speak on the e-book thing a little bit. I have some books I will not get rid of. Walter's Darkwing and other first edition signs are on my shelf for good. Cage Baker, same thing. I think she's no longer with us. But I have moved primarily to e-book, and I now have over 1,200 books on my e-reader. And the reason I've done that is my health. My knees are shot, space. I just ran out of room for books. We're looking at moving to Maine in a few years, having to be realistic now.
Some used bookstores in Maine,
I trust me. I've probably been all the ones in the Freeport area and the Brunswick area. But
Big chicken farm.
so for those people who are like going about ebooks, you have to look at it in the context. If it gets kids reading, who cares if it's a published book or an ebook? Because that's where I see my nephew can't read to save his life, and he's a sophomore in Arlington Catholic. I tried driving him to read, wouldn't read. I mean, he might read on an e-reader, something like that. To me, it's not how you're reading, it's the fact you're reading.
The idea that science fiction fans would reject technology seems.
Yeah.
It's an old tradition.
You never want to use an e-reader, don't use an e-reader. I was very anti-e-reader until I actually sat down and tried it. And then I realized we go to an island in Maine, no electricity, no plumbing, no running water. I have 1,298 books as of this morning on this. I don't ever have to worry about carrying 3 LL Bean bags of books with me for a week in case it rains again. All I have to make sure is I have my charger.
All right, John, do you have any last-minute wisdom to impart? You said you have some books to give away.
I do actually. As you exit the room, I have a big bag of free books here. If you want to pop through them, there's some free stuff out there. I didn't mention at the start that I'm not only a bookaholic enabler, because I'm a bookseller. I'm a writer, so I commit you in every direction. The only thing I wanted to sort of say at the end was I really liked what John was saying about the minutiae of books, because as someone who sells physical books, I understand the arguments for readers. But a couple weeks ago, a woman brought in a bunch of books to sell to the used bookstore, and at the bottom of this bin, there was a spoonful wrapped up in a napkin. It's a copy of Cavell's Alice, the limited edition. It was in terrible shape. The binding had been broken. One of the front end pages was missing. But I took that book out and I thought, there is something to the physical object of books. This is kind of exceptional. But there's something to the physical book itself that we adhere to. And it is is a little different reading than the ebook. But also having the book on the shelf, having the book presence can have that kind of effect as well. It's just such an odd thing because it's a communication form, but it's also this thing to be the best thing. So we have
We've been told we're done. Thank you for coming to our panel.